In the heart of Chennai, where the aroma of freshly ground masala and steaming idlis fills the air, stands a restaurant empire that once promised pure vegetarian bliss. But behind the gleaming steel plates and crisp white uniforms of Saravana Bhavan lay a darkness so profound it would shake the very foundations of South Indian culinary culture. This is the story of how an astrologer's prophecy turned a beloved restaurant mogul into a cold-blooded murderer, and how one woman's courage brought down an empire built on doses and blood. The morning mist clung to the hills of Kodaikanal like a shroud on October 31st, 2001. Forest guards Murugesan and Raman were making their routine patrol through the western Ghats when they stumbled upon something that would haunt them forever. There, among the eucalyptus trees and rolling slopes where honeymooners came to find romance, lay the strangled body of a young mathematics teacher named Prince Santhakumar. His lifeless eyes stared up at the gray sky, and around his neck, the marks of rope told a story of unimaginable brutality. What the guards didn't know was that they had just discovered the climax of a tale that began not with love, but with obsession, black magic, and the twisted dreams of one of India's most successful entrepreneurs. 1947 was the year India gained independence, and it was also the year Pichai Rajagopal was born into a family of modest farmers in Tuticorin, Tamil Nadu. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the sound of temple bells, a world away from the chrome and glass empire he would one day build. Young Rajagopal's hands knew the roughness of rice stalks before they ever touched the smooth surfaces of restaurant tables. His mother would wake before dawn to prepare simple meals of rice and sambar, never imagining that her son would one day feed millions across the globe. But even then, neighbors whispered about the boy's intensity, the way his dark eyes seemed to burn with an ambition that made others uncomfortable. The story of Saravana Bhavan begins like so many great Indian success stories, with a dream and 20 rupees. In 1981, Rajagopal opened his first small restaurant in Chennai's KK Nagar, naming it after the Hindu deity Saravana, son of Lord Shiva. The walls were simple, the tables basic, but the food was extraordinary. His sambar had the perfect balance of tanginess and spice. His doses were paper-thin yet sturdy enough to hold generous portions of coconut chutney and potato curry. Word spread like wildfire through the narrow lanes of Chennai. This wasn't just another South Indian restaurant, this was something special. By the 1990s, the red and gold sign of Saravana Bhavan could be seen from London to Singapore, from Dubai to New York. The boy from Tuticorin had become the undisputed dosa king, employing thousands and serving millions. But success, as they say, can be the most dangerous drug of all. As his empire grew, so did Rajagopal's belief in his own invincibility. He consulted astrologers regularly, convinced that the stars had ordained his success. His employees called him Anachi, Big Brother, and treated his word as law. Among these employees was a man named Ramaswamy, who worked as an assistant manager at one of the Chennai outlets. Ramaswamy was a quiet, hardworking man who took pride in his job and adored his daughter Jivajathi, a young woman whose name meant flame of life. She was 24 years old, with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet dignity that made people notice her even in crowded rooms. She had fallen in love with Prince Santhakumar, a mathematics teacher whose gentle nature complemented her strength. They were planning their wedding, dreaming of a simple life filled with books, students, and the everyday miracles that make up a happy marriage. But Rajagopal had other plans. In the year 2000, during a routine visit to the restaurant where her father worked, Jivajathi caught the attention of the dosa king. Perhaps it was her laugh, or the way she moved with unconscious grace, but something about her ignited an obsession that would consume him entirely. He began making inquiries about her, learning her routines, her dreams, her relationships. When he discovered she was engaged to Santhakumar, his obsession transformed into something darker, something that would ultimately destroy everything he had built. The first approach came through her father. Ramaswamy was called to his boss's office one evening, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls lined with awards and photographs of Rajagopal with celebrities and politicians. "Your daughter is very beautiful," Rajagopal said, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to getting whatever he desired. "I want to marry her." Ramaswamy was stunned. His daughter was already engaged, already in love. But this was his employer, a man who could destroy his livelihood with a single word. "Sir, she is already committed to someone else," he stammered. Rajagopal's face darkened. "Break the engagement," he commanded. "I can give her everything she could ever want. What can a teacher offer her?" When Jeevajathi learned of this proposal, her reaction was swift and decisive. She was not some prize to be claimed, not a business transaction to be negotiated. She loved Santhakumar, and no amount of money or power could change that. Her refusal reached Rajagopal like a physical blow. Here was a man who had conquered international markets, who had politicians and bureaucrats at his beck and call, being rejected by the daughter of one of his own employees. The humiliation burned within him, but more than that, the rejection fed his obsession. If he couldn't have her willingly, he would find another way. This is when Rajagopal made a decision that would reveal the true darkness of his character. He sought out astrologers and spiritual advisors, not for wisdom, but for validation of his desires. In the narrow lanes of Chennai, where ancient traditions mix with modern ambitions, he found what he was looking for. An astrologer told him what he wanted to hear, that marrying Jeevajathi would bring him even greater success, that the stars themselves had destined this union. Whether the astrologer truly believed this, or simply told a powerful man what he wanted to hear, we will never know. But these words became the foundation for everything that followed, the justification for actions that would shock a nation. The campaign of terror began subtly. Jeevajathi and her family started receiving anonymous phone calls at all hours of the night. Strange men would follow her to work, their presence a constant reminder that she was being watched. Her father found himself assigned to the worst shifts, given impossible tasks, made to understand that his family's comfort depended on his daughter's compliance. But Jeevajathi was not easily intimidated. She was the flame of life her name suggested, and she would not be extinguished by threats and manipulation. On February 14, 2001, Valentine's Day, Jeevajathi and Prince Santhakumar were married in a simple ceremony. The bride wore a red silk saree that had belonged to her grandmother, and the groom's hands trembled not with nervousness, but with joy as he tied the thali around her neck. For a few precious hours, surrounded by family and friends, they were just another young couple beginning their life together, innocent of the storm that was about to engulf them. But Rajagopal's rage at their marriage was like a wildfire that consumed everything in its path. The subtle campaign of intimidation escalated into open warfare. Jeevajathi and her new husband found themselves constantly harassed. Their apartment was broken into, their belongings destroyed. Santhakumar was beaten by unknown assailants who disappeared into the Chennai traffic before help could arrive. Still, the young couple refused to be broken. They filed complaint after complaint with the police, but Rajagopal's influence ran deep. He had friends in high places, politicians who owed him favors, officials who had enjoyed free meals at his restaurants. The complaints were filed, but investigations moved at the pace of government bureaucracy, which is to say, barely at all. The breaking point came in October 2001. Jeevajathi's family, desperate to escape the constant harassment, decided to take a pilgrimage to Tiruchendur, hoping that distance and divine intervention might bring them some peace. They hired a van and set off in the early morning hours, when the roads were still quiet and the temples would be filled with the prayers of the faithful. What they didn't know was that Rajagopal had been informed of their plans, that the van they had hired was driven by one of his men, and that their journey to seek divine protection would instead lead them into the hands of their tormentor. The van took several unexpected detours, and by afternoon, instead of reaching the holy temple, they found themselves at a Saravana Bhavan warehouse on the outskirts of Chennai. There, waiting for them with several of his henchmen, was Rajagopal himself. His face was a mask of cold fury as he ordered Santhakumar to be separated from the family. Jeevajathi's screams echoed off the concrete walls as her husband was dragged away, but her cries for mercy fell on deaf ears. This was the moment when the successful restaurateur fully transformed into something monstrous, when his obsession finally overwhelmed whatever humanity he might once have possessed. For hours, Santhakumar was beaten and tortured while Jeevajathi was forced to watch. Her pleas for his release met with demands that she agree to marry Rajagopal. The fluorescent lights of the warehouse cast everything in harsh, unforgiving shadows, and the smell of fear mixed with the lingering aroma of spices from the restaurant supplies. But even facing death, Santhakumar refused to release his wife from her marriage vows, and Jeevajathi refused to betray her love. Their courage in those terrible hours would later inspire a nation, but in that moment, it served only to fuel Rajagopal's rage. Finally, perhaps fearing that the prolonged disappearance of the family would attract unwanted attention, Rajagopal agreed to let them go. But freedom, for the young couple, would be brief and illusory. He had already made his decision about Santhakumar's fate. The only question was how and when to execute it. On October 26, 2001, just 12 days after their terrifying ordeal at the warehouse, the family was kidnapped again. This time, there would be no reprieve. Santhakumar was separated from his wife and her family, and as their van wound its way up the mountain roads toward Kodaikanal, he knew he would never see his beloved again. The hill station, famous for its romantic ambience and scenic beauty, would become his tomb. High in the western Ghats, with mist swirling around the eucalyptus trees and the lights of the valley twinkling far below, Prince Santhakumar took his last breath. The man Rajagopal had hired to kill him, known only as Daniel, was paid 50,000 rupees for the murder, a sum that represented months of salary for most people, but was merely pocket change for the Dosa king. Santhakumar's body was left among the trees, where couples came to pledge their eternal love, a cruel irony that would haunt everyone who learned of the case. When forest guards discovered the body on October 31st, the investigation that followed would expose not just a murder, but an entire system of corruption and influence that allowed powerful men to treat human lives as disposable commodities. Jeevajathi, now a widow at 25, faced a terrible choice. She could remain silent, accept whatever settlement Rajagopal might offer, and live the rest of her life knowing that her husband's killer walked free. Or she could fight, knowing that taking on one of India's most powerful businessmen would make her a target for the rest of her life. She chose to fight. In March 2002, 5 months after her husband's murder, Jeevajathi filed a detailed 39-page complaint with the Chennai police. Every page was soaked with her pain, but also with her determination to see justice done. She named Rajagopal as the mastermind behind her husband's murder and provided evidence of the months of harassment that had preceded it. The complaint was a devastating indictment, not just of one man's obsession, but of a society that allowed such obsessions to flourish unchecked. But filing the complaint was only the beginning of Jeevajathi's ordeal. The Tamil media, instead of focusing on the crime itself, launched into a campaign of character assassination against her. She was portrayed as a temptress who had somehow brought this fate upon herself and her husband. The newspapers were filled with salacious gossip and wild speculation, turning her tragedy into entertainment for the masses. The very people who should have been demanding justice for her husband's murder instead questioned her motives, her morality, her right to seek justice at all. Meanwhile, Rajagopal's lawyers were working overtime to discredit the case against him. They painted him as a successful businessman being targeted by a disgruntled former employee's family. They highlighted his charitable works, his contributions to temple construction, his role in providing employment to thousands of people. How could such a man, they argued, be capable of murder? The case became a battle not just between prosecution and defense, but between two very different visions of Indian society. On one side stood those who believed that wealth and power placed a person above the law. On the other stood those who insisted that justice must be blind to a person's status or influence. The investigation moved with agonizing slowness. Witnesses were intimidated or disappeared entirely. Key evidence went missing from police custody. Rajagopal's influence seemed to extend into every corner of the system, making it nearly impossible to build a case that would stand up in court. For months, it seemed as though the Dosa king's money and connections would protect him from the consequences of his actions, that Prince Santhakumar's murder would join the long list of crimes committed by the powerful and never punished. But slowly, painstakingly, investigators began to piece together the truth. They found the van driver who had taken the family to the warehouse. They located Daniel, the hired killer, who eventually broke down under interrogation and confessed to the murder. They traced the money that had changed hands and documented the web of corruption that had enabled the crime. Most importantly, they found the courage to pursue justice, even when it meant taking on one of the most powerful men in Tamil Nadu. In 2004, 3 years after Santhakumar's murder, P. Rajagopal and 10 others were finally brought to trial. The courtroom was packed with media and spectators, all eager to see whether the Indian justice system could convict a man whose restaurant served millions and whose political connections ran deep. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified to his obsession with Jeevajyothi, his threats against her family, his presence at the warehouse where Santhakumar was tortured. When the verdict came, it sent shockwaves through the business community. Rajagopal was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It was a victory for justice, but one that felt incomplete to those who knew the full extent of his crimes. 10 years seemed inadequate punishment for the cold-blooded murder of an innocent man and the destruction of a family's life. Rajagopal, however, was not finished fighting. His army of lawyers immediately filed an appeal, and he remained free on bail while the higher courts considered his case. For 5 more years, he continued to run his restaurant empire, his convictions seemingly just another business obstacle to be overcome through legal maneuvering and political influence. The sight of the convicted murderer, still appearing at restaurant openings and business events, was a bitter reminder to Jeevajyothi and her supporters that money could indeed buy a form of freedom that was denied to ordinary citizens. But the wheels of justice, though slow, continued to turn. In 2009, the Madras High Court delivered a judgment that would change everything. Not only did they uphold Rajagopal's conviction, they enhanced his sentence to life imprisonment. The court's reasoning was clear and damning. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of madness, but a calculated murder carried out by a man who believed his wealth and power placed him above the law. The enhanced sentence reflected the court's understanding that some crimes strike at the very heart of civilized society and must be punished accordingly. Still, Rajagopal did not give up. His case went to the Supreme Court of India, where it remained for another decade while he continued to enjoy his freedom. The legal battle became a test of the Indian justice system itself. Could the country's highest court stand firm against the pressure that comes with prosecuting the wealthy and powerful? Would they have the courage to send a message that no one, regardless of their status or influence, was above the law? During these years of legal maneuvering, Jeevajyothi lived in a kind of suspended animation. She had remarried and tried to rebuild her life, but the shadow of her first husband's murder and the freedom of his killer continued to haunt her. She faced ongoing harassment, not just from Rajagopal's supporters, but from social media trolls and others who seemed to take pleasure in her pain. Yet she never wavered in her demand for justice, never accepted the suggestion that she should simply move on and forget the past. The business community watched the case with growing unease. Saravana Bhavan continued to operate and expand, but the cloud of the founder's conviction hung over every new restaurant opening. Customers began to ask uncomfortable questions. Could they enjoy their doses and filter coffee knowing they were putting money into the pockets of a convicted murderer? The brand that had once been synonymous with wholesome vegetarian food was now associated with murder and corruption, a fall from grace that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Finally, on March 29, 2019, the Supreme Court of India delivered its verdict. In a judgment that was as much about the rule of law as it was about one specific crime, they upheld both Rajagopal's conviction and his life sentence. The court's message was clear and unambiguous. Wealth, influence, and political connections could not shield a person from the consequences of murder. Justice had been delayed, but it would not be denied. The order gave Rajagopal 4 weeks to surrender himself to prison authorities. For 18 years, he had used every legal stratagem and influence peddling technique at his disposal to avoid facing the consequences of his crime. Now, finally, his options had run out. The Dosa King would have to trade his business suits for prison clothes, his executive offices for a jail cell. But Rajagopal had one final card to play. As the deadline for his surrender approached, he claimed to be suffering from various health problems that made imprisonment impossible. He was admitted to a private hospital in Chennai, where his doctors declared him too ill to be moved to jail. The authorities were skeptical, but Indian law provides for medical exemptions from imprisonment in extreme cases. Once again, it seemed as though the convicted murderer might escape justice through wealth and manipulation. On July 7, 2019, just 2 weeks before the Supreme Court's deadline for his surrender, P. Rajagopal suffered a cardiac arrest at the hospital where he was being treated. Despite the efforts of a team of specialists, the man who had built a restaurant empire and destroyed a family died without ever serving a day of his life sentence. He was 71 years old, and he had spent the last 18 years of his life as a free man despite being convicted of murder. The news of his death was met with mixed reactions across India. Some saw it as divine justice, the ultimate punishment delivered by a power higher than any earthly court. Others viewed it as the final victory of a corrupt system that allowed the wealthy to escape accountability even in death. Jeeva, now in her 40s and trying to live a quiet life with her second family, issued a simple statement expressing her disappointment that her husband's killer had never faced the full consequences of his actions. The Saravana Bhavan empire survived its founder's death, but it was forever changed by the scandal that had consumed its final years. The restaurants continued to serve their famous dosas and sambar, but the brand carried the stain of its founder's crimes. New management worked to distance itself from Rajagopal's legacy, but the story of the Dosa King's fall from grace had become inseparable from the company's history. As we reflect on this extraordinary tale of ambition, obsession, and murder, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the society we live in. How does a successful businessman transform into a cold-blooded killer? What does it say about our justice system that a convicted murderer can avoid prison for 18 years through wealth and influence? How do we balance our admiration for entrepreneurial success with the recognition that some successful people are also capable of terrible crimes? The story of P. Rajagopal and Prince Santhakumar is not just about one man's obsession or one family's tragedy. It is a mirror held up to contemporary India, reflecting both our greatest aspirations and our deepest failings. It shows us the incredible heights that can be reached through hard work and determination, but also the devastating lows that result when power corrupts and wealth becomes a shield against justice. Perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that behind every headline about corporate crime or political corruption are real human beings whose lives have been forever altered by the actions of others. Jeeva lost not just her husband, but her sense of security, her privacy, and decades of her life to a legal battle she never should have had to fight. Prince Santhakumar lost everything because he had the misfortune to fall in love with a woman who caught the attention of a powerful man who believed he could take whatever he wanted. Today, as you pass by a Saravana Bhavan restaurant, as you smell the familiar aroma of South Indian spices and see families gathered around steel plates filled with traditional delicacies, remember this story. Remember that the food we eat and the companies we support have histories that extend far beyond their marketing messages and corporate branding. Remember that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that it is our responsibility as citizens to demand accountability from those in power, regardless of their wealth or influence. The legacy of the Dosa King is not just the restaurants that bear his name or the recipes that made him famous. It is also a cautionary tale about what happens when we allow success to become synonymous with immunity, when we mistake wealth for virtue, and when we forget that true greatness lies not in what we accumulate, but in how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society. In the end, Prince Santhakumar's memory lives on not in the empire built by his killer, but in the courage of those who refused to let his murder be forgotten, in the determination of a justice system that, however slowly and imperfectly, eventually held his killer accountable. His story reminds us that every life has value, that love is stronger than obsession, and that the arc of the moral universe, though long, does indeed bend toward justice. The next time you sit down to enjoy a South Indian meal, take a moment to honor the memory of a young mathematics teacher whose only crime was falling in love, and the brave woman who spent decades fighting to ensure that his death was not in vain. Their story is now part of our collective memory, a reminder of both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human depravity, and ultimately, the power of truth to triumph over wealth, influence, and corruption. This is the story of murder on the menu, the fall of the Dosa king, and the price of justice in modern India. It is a story that should never be forgotten, because forgetting the lessons of the past condemns us to repeat its mistakes in the future.